Greetings and welcome to another screencast from Dev Bootstrap. And today we're covering the Interface Segregation Principle. So what is that all about? Well, it's really about the interface and who owns the interface, right? Who owns and who defines the interface. And it's an important thing to understand because we realize that the interface should not be dictated or defined by the concrete class that uses it. This is the mistake that we made in previous cases where we took a class and we extract an interface from it and we're like, that's the interface we're going to use for our new class. Like in the case of the file store class, which saves a message to the disk, we wanted to implement an SQL class that saves the message to a database. So we just took the interface from the file store class and shoved it into the SQL class. And actually, that's not a good solution because we broke the list cost substitution principle by doing so. And instead, we need to remember that interfaces are used to help introduce loose coupling in our application. So therefore, it's not the concrete class that needs the interface, it's the client that needs the interface. And the client defines what it needs, and it's not going to define a method on the interface that it simply does not need. So that leads us to the idea of producing simple, focused interfaces, and further that are more role-based interfaces over header interfaces. And what are role and header interfaces? Well, a header interface, which is the type of interface that we do not want to use generally in our application, is really the fully extracted interface of a class. And it ends up being an interface that is extracted typically from a concrete class and generally includes way too many members. And that's really what we do not want. That's what we want to avoid. And so if you have a header interface with a large number of members, then it becomes unlikely that you'll ever have a need for the different concrete classes, and therefore that interface will only be used once, which really doesn't serve any purpose. And if you did implement it in other classes, you would end up needing to violate the list cost substitution process because you'd need to have a not supported exception all over the place. And so that's why we want to avoid header interfaces. And we want to prefer role interfaces instead. And role interfaces is simply an interface that defines very few members. So the fact that it's client-driven and the client owns these interfaces, then it's going to only define the members that it actually needs to talk to. So an extreme role interface is an interface that just has one member. And it actually turns out that defining role interfaces with just one member makes it easier to solve any violations of the list cost substitution principle. With only one member defined, there's no interaction with other members because, well, there aren't any. So let's take a look at our project again. So, and by the way, this is all inside this repository here under Dev Bootstrap. And in particular, we're covering this principle here, so you just go ahead and click onto here, and you'll get a full README file that covers the interface substitution principle. So if you recall from the previous video where we covered the list cost substitution principle, we found that we ended up violating that principle, right? Because what happened was, just for a recap, is that we produced this interface here, which was essentially a header interface. It contained all the methods of the file store class. And we basically applied it to our SQL store class and ended up having to implement a method that we don't need in the SQL store and therefore throwing this exception. And this is not good. This is breaking the list cost substitution principle. So what we've done in this project is we've made a few refactorings. And the main thing is that we've extracted out that into a new interface called iFileLocator. And that's where we define the getFileInfo method. And so by doing this, it means that the method no longer needs to be defined in the SQL store class. So the getFileInfo method does no longer needs to be defined. So if we take a look at the interfaces that we defined, and by the way, what you'll find is, as mentioned in the intro, you'll end up with defining quite a few interfaces, and a lot of them will probably look like this. When I say look like this, I mean it will have just one member. And so this particular interface defines the method required to locate a file info. And that means that because we've extracted it into its own interface, we can remove it from the iStore interface. And since we've removed it from the iStore interface now only has a save and read member, we can remove that problem from the SQL store class. And as you can see here now, the SQL store class implements the iStore interface and a new interface called iStore Writer. And therefore we can remove the method that we don't need, and thereby fixing the Liskov substitution principle violation that we had earlier. And we can also update our file store class. And here we have the iStore interface, iStore Writer interface, but we also have the iFile Locator interface, because this class needs that method, the getFileInfo, right? So we have basically, through this principle of defining role-based interfaces that only define members that the client needs, we end up with a nice solution whereby we avoid violating the Liskov substitution principle. And we end up creating a number of other different interfaces as well that we can look at here. So the cache, and we got a store writer. Again, this is a single method that defines a method, it's an interface that defines a single method that basically says this is where we write to the store. And this will be taken even further in the next principle, and the final principle, in fact, which is called the dependency inversion principle. And we're going to cover that in the next video. And this kind of ties everything together. All of the principles that we've covered in Solid kind of all come together in this final principle in the next video. So if you like this, please like, please share, please subscribe to this channel, and I hope to see you again in the next video. And meanwhile, please take care, and thank you very much.